I'm just giving one moment. Welcome everyone who's logging in. I'm just giving a few more seconds for any who may be logging in a little bit late.
Okay. We also just need to tell the attendees we will be promoting them to panelists. They have to accept to be in the virtual room, please.
Welcome everyone. To those logging in, you will see a notice inviting you to be upgraded, shall we say, to panelists. If you do see that notice, please just click accept for us. Let's get started. We might have a few more joining us in a few minutes, but I don't want to delay things any further. My name is Alex Benkenstein. I head up the Natural Resource Governance Program at the South African Institute of International Affairs, a South African think tank, but we work across the region. COP26, the global climate negotiations, are now just a few days away. I think you would have all seen the discussions, the media attention is rapidly ramping up, some big new announcements coming through. What we want to do today is to share some insights from work we did earlier in this year, and also leading up now into COP in the final few weeks, that firstly focused on bringing together African stakeholders to ensure that key messages from climate finance stakeholders could be identified and importantly could also be prioritized. We implemented this project together with the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, who are longtime partners of our institute. And just in terms of how we went about this process, there was an initial phase earlier this year of identifying, in consultation with stakeholders, the key themes related to climate finance. And we identified three. Obviously, coming from with an African perspective, adaptation finance was a very important focus. Private sector finance, also an element of discussion. And then looking at the interlinkages between COVID, the pandemic recovery processes, stimulus processes, and how that ties in with climate finance responses. So these were our three main themes. Then towards the middle of the year, we assembled a group of stakeholders and we essentially created that forum where these could be debated, those key messages could be identified, and as I said, then prioritized. Now, in addition to that, we've also worked with experts to develop policy briefings that would go into very focused key messages related to those key themes. So in the chat, I have put a link to the main report coming out of this project. I encourage you to access that. You'll also see there is a link to a report from a separate project, but that also deals with, to a certain extent, climate finance priorities, climate diplomacy, and the just transition, but with a particular focus on South Africa, whereas the main project we're here to discuss today looked at the Africa region in general. So we're going to have two short presentations. The first will be by Olivia Rumble. Olivia was the lead researcher on the project with us. She is a director at an outfit called Climate Legal. It's very active in the climate research, policy engagement space. That will then be followed by Alfonso Sommeren, Alfonso represents the African Development Bank here. He leads their green economy and climate work for the East Africa region. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over now to Olivia.
Thanks, Alex, and good morning, everyone. Hi, Alfonso. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning. I'm going to keep it relatively brief. Firstly, because it's media briefing, and secondly, because I'm dialing in from my phone. We have load shedding at the moment, so no fancy PowerPoints today, just my pretty face. But just to give you a quick sense, so we've been working with SIRE during these workshops, trying to crystallize and capture some of the key issues around particularly private finance, as well as COVID-19 and the green recovery. And in relation to private finance, we captured some of the key ideas with Jonathan first, as well as various other participants around how do we scale up private finance in order to unlock and unleash the trillions that we know that it can bring to the African continent. And that had very general components to it, things like changing regulatory systems, exchange rate stability, and creating more policies that are conducive to private sector investment. But it also had some climate specific issues, like can national governments, for example, incentivize through green bonds or tax incentives and the like to attract the private sector to the continent. In respect of COVID-19, what was really nice to hear from participants is that they were really calling on governments to build back better. And we know that a couple of African governments have really tried to do so, but they've lacked the fiscal space. And so we've seen, for example, measures like the African Green Stimulus Program being launched by the AU, and that really needs climate finance to get off the ground. And one of the asks at COP26 is for the requisite finance to channel funds through this program so that African countries can not only recover from the COVID pandemic, but also in doing so, build back better through resilient infrastructure spend, through mitigation spend and the like. Unfortunately, we're seeing that very few governments have actually done so worldwide. You may be familiar with that recent UNEP report that came out saying that about 17% of governments were actually greening their economies in their stimulus spends. And this is a call from African participants asking their governments to really try and think in a holistic way to take advantage of the trillions of finance that are circulating around the world and to marry those two objectives. And in particular, to carry that message to the COP that there is this massive opportunity to harness both the money that's coming in for COVID stimulus packages for climate purposes as well. So those are the two key findings coming out of the COVID-19 as well as the climate finance, the private finance work that we did. But for bandwidth reasons, I'm going to gently hand over to Alfonso.
Thank you, Olivia. Thank you for this very brilliant point. Thank you, Alex, as well. Good morning, everyone, and greetings from Nairobi. Now, I think if there's anything you probably, you media people have been hearing over the last few days, and you're going to continue to hear over the next few days, is that among many other things, this particular conference of the parties of the UNFCCC is what we call the Climate Finance COP. So finance is going to be a very critical element of conversation, discussions, and probably outcome of this particular COP, like this COP26. So, and if that is the case, the conversation within the African continent among policymakers, development partners, civil society, as well as how do we make a very compelling case for additional and new additional climate finance flows to Africa. And I think it's very important because if it's a climate finance COP, then it's more important for Africa more than any other region. Why is that? This continent remains the most vulnerable of all global regions to climate change, and adaptation becomes a priority for us. So of this, within this context of climate finance, adaptation finance is very critical for Africa. And a lot of conversation over the last few days, led by my institution, the African Development Bank, together with the Global Center for Adaptation and the work by other partners as well. They're very much looking around issues of scaling up adaptation finance. And I think for us as well in this discussion paper, in this report, and ultimately in this project, this has been the very thinking. We've been putting our heads and mind together around unpacking the barriers. Why has adaptation finance compared to mitigation finance, why has it been extremely low in Africa? And obviously we have to recognize that there are a number of issues, a number of challenges, and some of them are very internal to the African context, but also to the system, our institutional setup. So we've come up with a number of recommendations. And I think it's very important to understand that on the African continent, there is hardly no country in Africa today that does not have an existing policy framework for adaptation. It could be through the National Adaptation Program of Actions called NAPAs, and some of them we've transitioned, or it could be the National Adaptation Plans, the NAPs. Or even within the nationally determined contributions, there is a significant focus on adaptation. So we are very clear, and we have an existing framework, a policy framework about the actions to be taken on the ground to improve adaptation, but also to increase the resilience of our economies, of our communities and societies at large. However, one thing we found very lacking in most African countries, or rather ineffective, is that there is no standalone or integrated national adaptation financing framework. And one major outcome of our discussion in this paper is the need to develop a national adaptation financing framework. And what does this framework do? This framework must be the type, given the local context, must be able to detail out what are those, diverse financial instruments that are possible for adaptation. As we speak today, between 2014 to 2018, of all adaptation projects in Africa, 57% of them were concessional loans, 42% of them were grants. 57 plus 42, that is basically 99%. But then we have missed out on opportunities around equity investments. We've missed out opportunities around guarantees, risk-sharing facilities, resilience bonds. And so there are these financial innovations that we haven't used well for adaptation. And I think the National Finance and Adaptation Framework will look into that. But also, adaptation has been left to the public good. Can we make economic cases for adaptation investment? And can we develop project registers? So an adaptation financing framework is very critical. And I think it's something that we should explore at the national level so that we use that as a platform and an opportunity to scale up investment for adaptation in Africa. The second point, and probably I would like to keep it there, is the fact that private capital flows has been an enormous success for mitigation, but not the case for adaptation. We've got a lot to learn from mitigation. The success of mitigation on the continent means we can learn a lot for adaptation. But also we must also unpack what are the barriers to private investment in adaptation. And in this report, we looked at a number of issues around around enabling environment, but also around the use of some grant resources that we have, how we can make grant resources catalytic as opposed, for use for 100% project implementation. Now, finally, it's very important that we have adaptation objectives and adaptation goals, but they have to be very clear. Clear in the sense that they have to be very clear, not just to the public sector, but also the private sector. When we say adaptation investment on the ground, what does that mean? What is the business case there? And how can we engage different actors and ultimately attract different resources to be able to scale that up? Finally, adaptation is everybody's business. And if that is the case, then adaptation finance is going to be the business of everyone. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much. From my side, maybe also just very briefly, big numbers, make great headlines, and you would have seen that there's a lot of focus on the $100 million goal, $100 billion goal. Excuse me, $100 billion goal. That's a commitment made
yearly for the next 5 years. Yes,
yearly. That's a commitment made by developed countries to assist in providing climate finance to developing countries. The $100 billion goal yearly. Now, that goal hasn't been met. It hasn't been met in 2020, and in fact, it hasn't been met yet. So there's a lot of pressure. You also see that there's discussions already being driven from the Africa region about much more ambitious climate finance goals. Talk of up to $1.3 trillion by 2030. I think the main thing to take away from this is, yes, there's a lot of pressure, and it remains a priority for the Africa region to maintain and insist on accountability for these commitments. But what certainly come out of our discussion is that it's as much about the quality of the finance as about the quantity. And that speaks to the ease of access, the channels to access, the kind of bureaucratic hurdles that can sometimes mean that finance doesn't get to the countries where it's needed most, or doesn't address the issues where it's needed most. And as you've heard from Alfonso, part of that is this balance between mitigation, so actions that are trying to reduce carbon emissions. Big part of that is obviously looking at the power sector and the greater adoption of renewable energy technologies, investment in renewable energy technologies. So the mitigation, and then adaptation, where it's now a reality that climate change will have an impact and will have an ever greater impact as we move into the future. So while we invest and allocate finance to those mitigation activities, we must also invest in adaptation capacity. Olivia, you wanted to add a thought?
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you, Alex, but I think this is a useful platform to also discuss, as you were saying, some of the challenges that African stakeholders are having with these multilateral institutions and banks in accessing funding. And during our workshops, we really tried to unpack some of the day-to-day problems that stakeholders were experiencing. And an issue which I haven't seen canvassed quite a lot in other media outlets, and it's very relevant for South Africa, is the conditions that the Green Climate Fund is seeking to impose on the DBSA in order to access climate finance. And climate finance, by its nature, is meant to be unconditional. It is finance that flows from the developed to the developing world in order to meet certain climate objectives. And what the GCF has been asking the DBSA to do is to agree to net zero targets, which are in principle good and fine things, but it's a good example. It's not necessarily what the DBSA, particularly as a provider of loan finance and other concessional finance to Southern Africa, is willing to agree to. And that is one example of some of the types of issues that stakeholders have been raising around getting access to these multilateral institutions, and how developed countries are making it very difficult for stakeholders to do so. Alfonso.
Yes, thank you. And I think it's very important to talk about the quality of this, finance, much more than the quantity of it. And I think obviously the quantity doesn't negate the fact that we don't need enough on the quantity side. The point you've raised about JCF is very important. I think, for instance, a very poor country like South Sudan or Burundi, that we're writing a proposal to have access to climate finance, to build, weather systems, to be able to collect data. And then GCF says, we need you to be able to produce data of the last 30 years to provide as a justification or rationale that this is climate related, the climate rationale checkpoint there. And the country is trying to say, listen, if I had that, I wouldn't be coming to you asking for money. So it's very important the notion of climate finance should not have the level of conditionality that we're beginning to see. So that speaks to quality of access, but also it's also important to understand that we must recognize that when African countries come to these external funds, or whether bilateral or multilateral, they're not starting from zero. They're spending part of their money in dealing with climate change. They may not call it climate finance, in the budget or in their spending. But when you track down and you unpack the activities that are financed by the national budget, you realize these are climate finance. So, and I think it's important as well that the conversation as we go to COP should move away from here, we're begging you to help us. So no, we have our own skin in the game as well. We're coming with these resources. A country like Kenya has said over the next 10 years, they will be spending $8 billion. So on average, $800 million every year for the next 10 years. That is the level of conversation we should also be having to say it's a partnership. So it's a partnership. We are also bringing in part of our resources. We're developing our institutional framework to make sure that we achieve results on the ground. Thank you.
Great. Well, let's see if there are any questions. We've got some time available now. I would also mention that please do keep an eye on the chat function. I have inserted links there to a number of reports of relevance to this project, including the briefing now specifically on private sector finance. That briefing, as well as all the other briefings, will be available through SIA's website as well, and we do encourage you to engage with those. So I'm not seeing any indication of questions.
May I add in?
Yeah, so I was about to say, Olivia Alfonso, if you have any kind of concluding thoughts for us, we can do a last round from our side. Obviously, this is being live streamed, so we want to make sure that we complete all our thoughts. Obviously, everyone who's watching this is not going to have an opportunity to ask a question. So any final thoughts?
Alfonso, do you mind if I go?
Yeah.
No, I just wanted to say thank you to the media for covering this issue. I think it's extremely, extremely important that there is awareness and interest and interrogation of not just the numbers, but also the type of finance that's being provided, particularly for this COP. So I'm sure you've read about in various media outlets covering this issue, that this COP is one of the most important COPs that is going to happen since the Paris Agreement. So this is the COP where we really get into the nitty-gritty of some of the issues that we couldn't deal with in Paris in 2015. And one of those key nitty-gritty issues is climate finance, as Alex was explaining. And for us, particularly from an AU perspective or an African Group of Negotiations perspective, climate finance is effectively the issue. So I think it's really important that there's good South African and regional coverage on this issue. Sorry, I see there's a hand from Joseph.
Yes. Joseph, you're welcome.
All right, Joseph,
Alfonso.
go first. No, let Joseph go first.
Yes.
Thank you very much. I have to admit, I'm sorry, I just became aware of this this discussion at exactly 9 a.m. when it was starting. So I had to quickly register, but I find it is a very important discussion. And I must also admit, I'm kind of new to this subject, to this subject, especially the climate financing issue. So you forgive me if my question is not is not up there. But looking at the way we are approaching climate financing, I can't help it but have a sense that we will end up the financing tools that we are focusing on. We may end up being those that are not kind of inclusive. We talk of inclusive finance, but we may end up, if we're looking at only issues of green bonds, and the other instruments that we're thinking about. I'm worried that we may be only targeting, we may be only looking at instruments that only big private investors can be using. But I think in the African context, you may agree that maybe our biggest problem lies with ordinary people. The issues of deforestation and stuff like that is done at a very, if I can call it, grassroots level. And I'm wondering if these climate financing tools will be able to address issues at that level. I don't know. I just want to hear your thoughts. That's my kind of thinking. I just want to hear your thoughts about whether these financing instruments, in other words, are really tailor-made for African economies, for which most people are in the informal economies. They're doing small farming, small businesses. Are we going to be able to finance some activities that these people may want to be doing? If a small farmer may want to grow some trees or whatever green projects at his level that he may want to do. I don't know if it makes sense. Just want to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you very much.
Absolutely, and it's spot on. It's an astute question, and in fact, it was a theme that did come up in our discussions as well. There are two parts to that answer, and I'll just give it a very high level before handing over to Alfonso and Olivia. But I think the two kind of main framings of the answer is, number one, it is true that when we talk about GCA grants or some of these big climate finance agreements that need to be applied for, we're talking about multi-million-dollar projects typically. So these are large programs or projects. The two aspects that I was talking about is, number one is to ensure that in the design and implementation of those large projects, that is done in an inclusive manner that is sensitive to vulnerable groups and the ultimate impact, and ensuring that impact is felt at ground level. So obviously large projects can bring direct benefits to community level. If you think about investments in climate resilient infrastructure, various sorts of interventions that can be made. That's the one point. The second point is then to think about how some of these institutions applying and securing that finance can essentially act as intermediaries, if you will, and then be able to subdivide that financing into a series of smaller packages that can then address those projects at a smaller scale. So I think that's just in terms of the broader framework of the response, it's probably those two elements that one should focus on. Alfonso?
No, thank you. And thank you, Joseph, for your question. So 2 questions in one, if I got it correctly. The first is about, some of these instruments that we're clamoring for, we just hope that they may fit into the African context. And that's a very good concern. But I have a good news for you. Some of the ideas that are coming on board right now are actually new ideas that have been tested in Africa. Resilience bonds, sometimes we may not call it exactly that, but there are examples, best practices that we can refer to on the African continent. One of the instruments that we're pushing for is the debt for climate swap. And this is very significant because, we're dealing, one of the key topics here was the twin challenge of COVID-19 pandemic, as well as climate change. And we have examples. In 2008, after the global crisis in Seychelles, the global financial crisis, Seychelles decided that they wanted what they call debt for biodiversity swaps, because they had been impacted by climate change. And it worked, and it was a huge success. And it's become a model that we're looking at. There's also a similar one I can't remember in Senegal as well. So we are building on these local experiences. And it's very important to be able to say, yes, these are things that can work. Now, Joseph, I want you to think about two layers in addressing this. There is the global to national, and that is the whole conversations about, the climate finance globally. What does that mean for an African country and all that? But then there is also national to local, and that is where post COP26, we still need to ask ourselves what next, and that what next is at national level. How does that translate from these global ideas, global contributions, to a local person who is going to make those land use changes, land use decisions that are consistent with management and ultimately adaptation and mitigation. And that is where our own understanding of national financing landscape, it's very important. And I can give you an example. In a country like Rwanda, there is a plan to move from the Central Green Fund to up to district level, and where project development are encouraged at the district level, even to the point that capacity development and project proposals are done there. And then at national level, finances are disbursed for operations on the ground. So it's possible. In Kenya, there are 47 counties, like state, and each county, well, more than half of them, has a climate change fund, which they do their own mobilization in addition to that. So there are examples to reflect on. And my final word, and thanks to media for covering this is very important. We have a lot to reflect on. There are things that are currently existing in our countries, but they don't get the attention that are needed, and sometimes they probably need to be a little bit modernized. And I want to encourage Saya and probably Kaz to, beyond, we need to ask ourselves, post COP26, what next? And I think maybe consider that as a new project. What next? What does that mean on the ground? Because if we're not careful, we've been here before many times. The days of CDM, the days of $100 billion. We're talking about $100 billion, but the donors are saying we've been giving 80 billion every year. And then we are like, we can't find it, we can't see it. We haven't, been part of that. So we need to also ask questions about what does it mean? What for us? How do we need to transform our system? What changes do we need to make in order to be able to turn these global opportunities to local realities? Thank you.
And if I could just add to your excellent points, Alfonso, I think, Joseph, you echoed exactly what a lot of our stakeholders were saying. So there is some money, 80 billion, we're not necessarily seeing it coming from the global to these regional institutions that is in turn supposed to trickle down to local stakeholders. And there are a couple of bottlenecks in accessing that money. And for example, as Alex was saying, if you want to apply to do a solar project, you wouldn't be able to go to the GCF, for instance, the Green Climate Fund. You would have to fill out thousands of pages to do so, etc. It wouldn't be appropriate to apply directly. You need your government to support you, all of that. So you would be looking to national institutions, typically your national banks or something a bit more local, in order to access that funding. And that's why a lot of our stakeholders have been calling for what we call accreditation under the Green Climate Fund. So under the Green Climate Fund, they have the DBSA, the AFDB, and those entities in turn disperse funds. And what stakeholders are asking for is, please, can we have more of those accredited entities so that they can trickle funds down to a national level? And that's why the fight between and the accreditation of the DBSA is such an important example of some of the challenges we're seeing in getting those bottlenecks resolved and getting funding to a national level. And as Alfonso was saying, it's not just about having more banks to give funding, but we also need governments to step in and come up with, for example, trust funds, like Seychelles has done, for instance, that can give more micro-sized project finance to, for example, adaptation projects or renewable energy and the like. And we're not seeing many of those on the continent, but we are seeing some. And it's really up to local governments or national governments to harness these opportunities and create those type of funds and provide the type of certainty that those funds give, that it is ring-fenced and allocated for certain purposes. And then just very lastly, one comment that came from stakeholders is that it's also up to national governments to support private finance coming in, for example, by giving credit enhancement mechanisms. So effectively, if I'm a small scale renewable energy developer, it's very hard for me to get a loan. But if I can get at least some funds from government through public finance to get my project investment ready, then it's easier for me to go to the private sector and get the rest of the funding that I need to get my project off the ground. So it's a partnership between the public and the private sector in really getting these projects at a local level towards feasibility and ultimately completion stage.
Yeah, absolutely. Olivia touched on a very important theme there, which is leveraging the grant finance, and the grant finance would never in itself be enough to deal with those issues. But we've had a few themes. Alfonso was saying earlier, African governments are putting their own money into this, and one needs to make sure that public expenditure generally, every planning cycle has an infrastructure investment budget around it at a public level. So we need to ensure that those infrastructure investments are investing in climate resilient infrastructure. We need to make sure that we use the grant financing that is available to leverage and crowd in private sector investments, the point that Olivia was making. And we can use certain interventions, guarantees by development banks and by governments to de-risk investments, and again, facilitate that crowding in of private sector investment and other partners to come on board. Well, the climate finance, all of us can tell you, the climate finance world and the debates, it is a complex space, and there are a lot of dimensions, and it's very easy to kind of go down a rabbit hole on particular elements around how risk or guarantees and the different distribution mechanisms and so forth. But I think the benefit of our discussion today, and also the framing of the reports that you'll see, is that it does try and prioritize and bring those core messages across, and then go into the detail based from there. And we've touched on that today. It's the quantity and the quality focus. It is heightened ambition. It's accountability for the commitments that are made, and it's looking across the better balance between adaptation and mitigation, and then it's looking across those various themes that we've highlighted today of green stimulus, private sector engagement, and then going into more detail about specifically what's required on adaptation. So I think there's plenty of material there. We do still have a minute or two if there is another question. But I think, as I can see, I don't think we're going to have another question. So it's really pretty much for me to thank Alfonso and Olivia. They've put a lot of time into this, and again have made themselves available for this morning's session. And thank you to you who have participated. Again, I've said it several times, but I again want to encourage you to engage with the material. It is available on the SIRE website, and you can then also, of course, contact us through the website. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks,
everybody.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Go well. Bye.